I call the honourable member Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Thank you very much, Minister, for getting up and clarifying some of that. It is good to see the Honourable Simon Power take a call on this, because as we heard from Simon Bridges a while ago, actually 40% of the legislation put through by the national government is actually sponsored by Mr Power. It'll be sad to see a hard-working minister leave. We all wonder why the Honourable Simon Power has decided to leave. I suspect it's because he's sick and tired of carrying the rest of his colleagues. But as the minister did mention, this may be a little bit confusing to those that have followed this bill, because in the first reading we talked about the Securities, Trustees and Statutory Supervisors bill, and we brought it together with the Financial Markets Regulators and KiwiSaver bill. And so in one speech we were talking about two quite large bills, and as Mr Power said, the Honourable Simon Power said, it's quite unusual to wrap two pieces of legislation together. However, we did this because the pieces of legislation were actually quite similar in their intent. But at the moment, in committee stage, we are just talking about the Securities, Trustees and Statutory Supervisors bill. And Mr Chair, I'd like to come back to part one. And I'd like to agree with Mr Power, with Simon Power on this. As we know, there were many New Zealanders who were actually rorted of their life savings due to what I believe was negligence, perhaps incompetence, and I won't go any further than that, on behalf, let's say negligence, on behalf of a lot of the trustees or statutory supervisors managing these financial companies, etc. So what was needed to return confidence back to the market, to give New Zealanders confidence that they could come back to the market, was legislation that ensured that trustees or statutory supervisors actually could be capable of performing or effectively performing the functions of trustees and statutory supervisors. And if we look at part one of this bill, preliminary provisions, this talks about the purpose of the bill. And I'd like to quote here: the purpose of this Act is to protect the interests of security holders and of residents of retirement villages. Now, this is most important, and the reason I say that is because there is a very wide perception out there, of which I am one, and I hold this perception, is that in fact the interests of security holders, and I don't know that much about residents of retirement villages, but certainly the people that have come into my office and the people that I liaised with who lost their life savings, had the perception that in fact they were not well looked after by their statutory providers. And if I continue there, and I quote, and to enhance investor confidence in financial markets and retirement villages. And then it sets out three things: by requiring persons who wish to be appointed as trustees or statutory supervisors to be capable of effectively performing the functions of trustees and statutory supervisors. Now that may seem, that's common sense. Of course we want the people who have been appointed as trustees or statutory supervisors to act in a competent manner. But what happened is, in fact, they did not perform in a competent manner. They did not undertake their duties. And I must say here, I don't want to stereotype every single trustee or statutory supervisors, because no doubt there were some who did their work with diligence. There were some very good ones there. So I don't mean to bring every single statutory supervisor or trustee into this. And when I'm maligning certain companies, and I think a lot of people know who I'm talking about or know what I'm talking about, a number of them have in fact appeared before the courts, and a few of them have been sentenced, and some have actually too come before the courts and sit and hopefully be judged by a jury of their peers. But what we need to do for every single New Zealander who has lost faith in our capital markets is to ensure that the confidence exists. Now, there is risk every time you invest in any sort of investment, and a prudent investor understands this risk. And a prudent investor will manage this risk, and that's why you get a return over and above the sort of risk-free rate of return. If there was no risk whatsoever, you'd invest in US Treasury bonds or something like this, or you put the money in Kiwi Bank, something with absolutely no risk. But there are organisations that pay an interest rate above the risk-free rate of return, and that is about pricing risk. And so it is up to investors to understand that and manage it for it. But one of the risks that I believe they should not have to manage for, one of the risks that they should not have to take into account, is a risk of negligence or a risk of incompetence on behalf of the statutory supervisors or the trustees. Because that is a risk that is never taken into account, because it's incredibly difficult to quantify. I suspect now, Mr Chair, that a lot of people who are investing in our capital markets... Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Chair.